Hi, I'm Mark Beebe, believer in Jesus Christ. I struggle with codependency. It's good to be with you. We're going to continue our series on strongholds. And we've been talking about strongholds as something that goes on in your life that works like a patch on your heart. And try as you might pull it off or get it off by yourself, you can't do that. And it becomes in every way something that dominates thoughts, emotions, and everything in between. And so we're going to work on the stronghold of shame for this particular week. And next week, then we'll start talking about how do you heal and experience freedom from these strongholds. That'll probably be that talk will probably be a week or two. So I want to start with asking you if you'd pray with me. Sweet Jesus, thank you for this time. We're going to talk about some stuff that we really don't want to talk about in most cases today. And we just thank you in advance for your compassion and care of us and our emotions and our histories and our past. And we just want to pray that you open us up to your freedom and maybe most importantly right now, your love for us. Your love and care for us, that we know that you just are walking with us as we do this and loving us and just wanting to be with us in every way and bring us a calmness and a resolve that no matter what we talk about, you're always for us. In your sweet name we pray, amen. So shame, we're going to get into the difference between guilt and shame as we do this. But Brene Brown is someone that I think is an extraordinary teacher. She teaches in a lot of cases on this exact topic of shame. You can look her up on Google and see 4 or 5 different talks. One is a really good TED Talk that she did on the topic of shame. She's also written extensively about it. She's one of the few people that has really done a tremendous job studying this experience. And so I wanted to start off with something that she wrote, and it goes like this. I define shame, she says, as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed or broken, and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. 2 essential pieces of healthy free living. Unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. You know, it's such a big deal in what we're doing with recovery. So many issues that involve compulsion, so much stuff about codependency, so much stuff that comes out of life experiences like divorce revolves around this conversation about what happens when I get to a place of being ashamed of myself. Meaning that I find myself believing that I must necessarily disconnect from the love and acceptance of others because I am somehow permanently tainted and permanently inadequate when it comes to deserving love and care and interaction from others and really ultimately from God and also myself. The difference in shame and guilt is like this. When I'm guilty of something, I kind of go, man, I really did a bad thing. I mean, like I drove too fast and I got a ticket. I did this. I walked out of the store and I forgot to pay for that. Whatever it is. It's I did something bad. Shame translates like this. It's not just that I did something bad. It's that I'm a bad person. Now, I mean, sometimes it might be true that enough of a compilation of, quote, doing bad things, end quote, will take you to a place of shame. But there's a definite distinction between guilt saying I did something bad and shame saying, look, I'm just a bad person, unworthy of love and acceptance from God, others, and myself. So Guilt focuses on behavior, and shame is a focus on self. And I really have come to believe and understand, which is why we push trauma as a huge component of recovery so much. What Vicki Haverbush teaches with Trauma 1 and Trauma 2, we think is a critical piece for a lot of us for recovery, and it will end, in a lot of cases, it'll end the log jam that is causing relapses. It'll end the log jam that is causing us to not be able to move forward with real recovery and real sobriety. It'll end the log jam of me trying to figure out why I walk around so on edge, why I walk around so miserable, and why I walk around feeling so unworthy. We're trying to set up the schedule for Trauma 1 this fall again. Hopefully you'll be seeing that soon, and we'll get that on recoverycokesbury.com and make an announcement and talk about it as soon as we come to a decision about the whens and the wheres of that. But if you've never taken a Trauma 1 class, and you know that you just have that feeling that you're really not moving forward with your recovery, that you're really struggling with what it is that's happening here, what it is that has been made available to you, and why it doesn't seem to be clicking, man, I'm going to really recommend that class, because I really think, above anything else, that the debilitating power of shame is hugely important. It's paramount to what happens with recovery. If you can begin to deal with that, and if you can begin to get that stronghold in check, and that stronghold, get yourself free from that, that takes a lot of work, but if you can do that, you're going to find a much more substantial opportunity to move forward with real, purposeful, and impactful recovery in your life. Some of the things that go on that are sure and certain indicators of shame are these. Number one, shame breeds and grows and develops best in an environment of secrecy and silence. The stuff I'm not talking about is either going to be in my life the stuff that I'm afraid of, or the stuff that I'm ashamed of. Either the stuff that I'm afraid of or the stuff that I'm ashamed of. Second growing environment of shame would be the experience of ongoing judgment. Ongoing judgment. And the judgment that shame yields is toward myself. Like I bring it onto myself. I become my own judge and jury. I become my own assessor of what's going on in my life. And I am probably my own worst critic, and I'm probably the hardest jury I'm ever going to face, and I'm probably the hardest judge that I'm ever going to face. That's a component of shame. Third component of shame is misplaced identity. I begin to believe that the experience of the cross absolutely has an asterisk beside it. And when it says that Jesus died for the brokenness and the shame of the whole world, took on all the stuff, past, present, and future, for all of us, for all time, there's an asterisk there. And the asterisk, if you look on the bottom of the page of that part of the Bible, what is there? Guess what? It's my name. Because this is the way that I would read. You know, that God was in Jesus reconciling the whole world to himself, reestablishing our relationship, reconnecting us to each other, loving us, bringing us back into his family. All of that is the way I read it, is in an exact opposite way if I'm in the middle of the stronghold of shame. This is how I read it. Jesus died for good people so that they could do good things. Jesus died for good people so that they could do good things. Well, so what happens if I'm in the middle of the stronghold of shame? Well, I don't see myself, first of all, as being anything close to being a good person. So secondly, that would mean that Jesus didn't die for me. I'm on my own because I'm not a good person. Again, not that I did bad things, but it said I'm not a good person, so I'm out because of that. And then so that they could do good things, since I'm ashamed of myself, and since that is pervasive in my understanding of myself, and since when I start off the day, I already feel less than, and I already feel like a failure, and I already feel inadequate to face the challenges of the day, and I already know that at the end of the day, I'm going to feel as badly or worse about myself, which is why it's insidious, than I do when I get up in the morning, because shame is like that. It builds on itself and builds on itself and builds on itself. It doesn't ever really lessen like any other stronghold. That's an indicator of strongholds, is they only, as long as they're a stronghold, they only increase, they never lessen. There's no sort of being free from them. There's all the way being free from them or not being free from them at all. And as long as I'm not free from my stronghold, that's what we mean by saying they're insidious. It will continue to grow. It will continue to get bigger. It will continue to become more dominant in my life. A sheer indicator of shame is that I have that less than living that I'm talking about. And then I have squirrels in the attic. Like, it seems like I'm being bombarded with new worse things, new things that I judge myself about, and I always feel like it's one bad thing, another bad thing, another bad thing, another bad thing, and I'm not asking myself in my house, if, you know, when I moved into this house, I don't know, second or third year I lived here, we moved into this house, and so in this house, we rented it. So it's a nice house and all, but in this house, there was an actual legitimate room that was a study. I mean, it's the only house I've ever lived in where there was a room that had a legitimate study. So I was all very, very happy to have a study. You know, so like I would go in there and do stuff, and I would the first couple of days I was in there, I was like, it seemed like I was hearing this weird noise, and so like I listened a little more, and there was even more of this little scurrying around, and every time you were upstairs in certain rooms on the one side of the house, you would hear this scurrying. So like I didn't really know what it was. I thought maybe it was rats or mice, or I don't know what it was. So I got an exterminator to come over there and look at it, or the owner of the house did. So they go, you got about 30 flying squirrels up there, and they're having a field day. And they trapped some of them and stuff and thought they were gone, but the owners didn't want to pay to have them close the points of entry that they found, like how they were getting in, because they were flying from these trees that were fairly close to the house on the one side. They were flying into the house, right? Well, they didn't want to pay to close up the points of entry, how they were getting in. They didn't want to attend to those vulnerable places like us. Well, what happened? Everything was okay for a few months, and a year later, I'm hearing the same noise again, because guess what? Squirrels are getting in. Guess why? Points of vulnerability. What are our points of vulnerability that relate to the building of shame, if that's a stronghold for us in our life? Usually, the point of vulnerability is going to take you back to what one of your two or three main schemas are. We've talked about those along the way here. If you've never done a schema inventory, you really should. You owe it to yourself to do that. But usually they're related to that. Without closing the points of entry, expect a feeding and a nourishing and a nurturing of this destructive emotion and stronghold of shame. You got to know where you're vulnerable. You got to know where you're the most open to the most destruction. There's a different way of understanding freedom from this, from this stronghold. And like always, it obviously connects to the present authority of resurrection. Maybe you've never heard resurrection talked about as a present authority. Maybe you've only thought about resurrection as what we talk about on Easter Sunday, and maybe you think of resurrection as what happens when you die, and maybe you don't really think about death a whole lot, and maybe you're like, well, somewhere down the line, that'll be a good thing to know. I'm glad that if you're a Christian, I'm glad that I know Jesus. I'm glad that I have a confidence in the fact that I'm going to be raised from the dead in Jesus. But see, like, no one ever said that resurrection isn't a present tense activity. And there absolutely is a resurrection victory over shame. Here are some of the components of that resurrection victory. And these come also from Brene Brown. And they're just, man, I think, honestly, they're terrific. They're terrific antidotes, terrific freedom fighters for this stronghold of shame. Number one, know the trigger. Back to what we were talking about with the squirrels. Know what are the points of entry. Where are you vulnerable in your life? Where do you feel less than adequate? Where do you feel incomplete? Where do you feel like you have let someone, yourself, or somebody else, or something down? Where have you gotten to a place where stuff that you've done has caused you to decide you yourself are less than? What are the things that trigger those feelings of shame and bring those up, rise those up inside of you? Number two, do a reality check. Maybe you're so codependent that you have taken personal responsibility for something that happened to one of your children, something that happened to one of your siblings, something that happened to you even, something that happened to one of your parents, to where you have to ask yourself, is that true? Let's say you have a sibling. Let's say you have a sister. Let's say that when you were 6 years old, you somehow knew that your sister was being sexually abused or molested by your dad, or for that matter, by your mom. Let's say you knew that that was happening. Let's say that you didn't say anything to anybody about that when you were 6 years old. Let's say at 6 years old you were afraid to do that. Let's say that your sister really struggles as a result of that experience later in life, and let's say she develops some kind of a chemical addiction. And as that's going on in her life, the whole time what's worrying about in you is that you believe that you're a bad person because you should have stood in the way of that molesting. You should have done something about it. You should have stopped it. You should have said something. And let's say one of the points of vulnerability is your sister, the addict, regularly reminds you of that failure on your part. That's just one example of what I'm talking about. But then, so that's the experience as you are perceiving it, and that's what's driving the shame. All right, so now, do the reality check. At 6 years old, what exactly could you have done? Well, you could have done a couple things, I suppose, but what exactly could you have done that is reasonable and realistic? I mean, is it likely that a 6-year-old is going to go tell the other parent that that's happening? Likely not. If you were somewhat afraid of your dad when that was happening, were you going to say anything? No. If your dad said something, if your dad somehow knew that you knew, this happens all the time. If your dad knew that you knew and said to you, don't you ever say anything to anybody or I'm going to get you, are you probably going to jump over top of that threat and say something to somebody? Probably not. That's the reality check. Did I have a part? What was my part? Is the way that I'm perceiving my part, for people that are codependent, is the way that I was perceiving my part authentic and legitimate? Is it real? Is it authentic? And is it legitimate? And is it accurate? 3, share your feelings of shame with someone who loves you. Share your feelings of shame with someone who loves you. Just share them outright. This is going to connect to something I'm going to talk about in a minute. Share your feelings about being ashamed with somebody who loves you. You're going to know the difference between talking about guilt and talking about shame based on the emotions that it brings about in you. If you're talking about feeling guilty about something, that you really screwed this up, you got a speeding ticket, you lost, got it, you're going 105 miles an hour because you were playing around, you got this ticket, it was for reckless driving, cost you $700. You can talk about that like pretty, relatively plain Jane from an emotional state. You can talk about, failing an exam in college because you didn't show up for it, or didn't study and blew a semester, or ended up having to go an extra semester. You can talk about stuff like that all day long. And you feel guilty about it. You feel guilty about messing up a relationship. You feel guilty about a breakup or whatever, but you're not ashamed of it. And you're not going to talk about it with the same emotional energy. A surefire assessor of something that I'm ashamed of is that when I begin to talk about something that I'm ashamed of with somebody who loves me, I know that I trust them, I know that they accept me, but I'm still probably, when I'm talking about that, I'm going to be tearful. It's probably going to well up significant emotion in me, and I'm going to be tearful. I'm going to be crying about that as I talk about it. Sure indicator. When you talk to yourself about something that you're ashamed of, practice talking to yourself in a way and in a style that you would talk to somebody that you love. Like in healthy parenting, when your child does something that's just kind of ridiculous and you're ready to kill them, you probably don't say to them, "You're such an idiot. I can't believe how dumb you are. You're an absolute fool. And you know what? Because you're such an idiot, I don't think I'm ever going to love you again." You look at your child who you love and you express your frustration while at the same time evoking a style that tells the child that they know that you still love them, right? You're direct, but they know that you still love them. That comes out of you. Well, what happens when you talk to yourself in the way that you talk to someone that you love? Instead of being hypercritical about what a failure you are and how ashamed of yourself you should be and how this adds to the shame that you're already carrying, you begin as a part of that reality check to say, is this true? Did this happen? Is the way I'm seeing this accurate? And then I learn how to lovingly talk to myself about myself and hear myself about myself in a way that I would talk to somebody that I love. Here's the bullet of all of those pieces of resurrection, is that shame cannot handle being spoken out loud. Like when you start to talk about shame out loud and you're doing it with someone that you trust and love, I will guarantee you it will begin to dissipate. I will guarantee you it will begin to dissipate. That's why therapy is so effective to deal with this. That's why groups are so effective to deal with this. Open share groups, other recovery groups. That's why our trauma group is so effective at dealing with this, because shame can't withstand being the intervention of being spoken out loud. Can't handle it. Doesn't know what to do with it. Diminishes it and eventually dissipates it, kind of like oil and water. Kind of like oil and water. It's important to understand that. Shame's gotta grow in the dark. It's gotta always be in the dark. Here's my question. What's your net worth right now, today? What would you say your net worth is right now, today? I want you to hear what Jesus has to say that answers that question as far as he sees it. So it's a story about this woman who was an adulteress. She was sleeping with other people. Some guys found out about her. They thought they were better than she was. Their behavior was somehow better than she was. They were her judge and jury, and they were outright on this particular day trying to set up in this woman's heart and in her thoughts and life and understanding of herself, they were absolutely trying to set up a shame-based reality. So the story goes, they were trying to trap Jesus into saying something they could use against him. They were sitting there asking him, what do you think about her? What about her? What are you going to do with her? We know the story about her. You know the story about her. What are you going to do about her, Jesus? But Jesus stooped down and wrote something in the dust with his finger. What do you think he wrote? What do you think he put in the dust? I imagine that the word that he put in the dust was the word beloved. He loved that woman. It wasn't that he accepted what she did. It wasn't that he approved of her brokenness, but he loved that woman. He used the present authority of resurrection right then to love that woman. I think he wrote the word beloved right there. The guys kept on demanding an answer, so Jesus stands up and says, all right, here's your answer. Let the first one of you guys who has never sinned throw the first stone at her. Because, see, in that day, the deal was if you were an adulteress or an adulterer, you got stoned to death. I'm not sure what they did to men, but if you were a woman, you got stoned to death. That was the protocol. Let every one of you guys who's never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down and wrote something else in the dust. You know what I think he wrote down in the dust there about those guys? I think he wrote down something like on the run from being loved, or incapable of being loved, or incapable of loving themselves, or great scorekeepers, but not very good at being loved. Something like that. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? See, at that point in the story, there was only really one accuser there. She was her own accuser. And the enemy, since it was a stronghold of hers, this shame, the enemy was feeding her that lunch, that emotional lunch every day. Didn't even one of those guys condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. And my question for you is, what do you think it's going to take, and when is it going to work for you to go over to where Jesus wrote what he wrote to her in the dust and read those words that were spelled out there, those letters that spelled out the word beloved? And when is that going to be your net worth? Not the way you've assessed yourself, not the way your shame is telling you about it, not the way somebody else is telling you about it. When is it going to be a singular word written in the dust by Jesus that sets your net worth? Beloved. Thanks so much for being a part of this. In Jesus' sweet name, amen.